Sarah Martinez had always dreamed of becoming a nurse. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she watched her grandmother care for sick neighbors with gentle hands and a warm heart. That image stayed with her through high school, college, and nursing school. Now, at 24, she was finally living her dream as a registered nurse at Memorial Veterans Hospital in San Antonio. The hospital was massive, with over 800 beds and thousands of staff members. For Sarah, it felt like entering a different world every morning. The hallways buzzed with activity as doctors rushed between rooms, medical equipment beeped constantly, and families gathered in waiting areas with worried faces. The Veterans Wing, where Sarah worked, held a special place in her heart. These were men and women who had served their country, and now they needed care in their most vulnerable moments. Sarah had been working at the hospital for only 3 months. As the newest nurse on the floor, she often got the most difficult shifts and the most challenging patients. Some of the older nurses looked at her with skepticism, wondering if this young woman from a small town could handle the pressure of a major hospital. Sarah was determined to prove them wrong. Her supervisor, Mrs. Patricia Henley, was a stern woman in her 50s who had been working at the hospital for over 20 years. Mrs. Henley believed in strict rules and procedures. She often reminded the staff that any deviation from protocol could result in serious consequences, including termination. Sarah respected Mrs. Henley but sometimes felt intimidated by her harsh approach to management. The Veterans Wing housed patients of all ages, from recent veterans in their 20s to elderly men who had served in World War II and the Korean War. Each patient had a story, and Sarah made it her mission to learn about their lives and experiences. She believed that understanding their backgrounds helped her provide better care. One particularly busy Tuesday morning in October, Sarah was assigned to care for 8 patients during her 12-hour shift. The autumn weather had brought an increase in respiratory problems among the elderly veterans, and the wing was fuller than usual. Sarah moved efficiently between rooms, checking vital signs, administering medications, and providing comfort to worried family members. Among her patients that day was Robert Bob Williams, a 78-year-old Marine veteran who had served 2 tours in Vietnam. Bob had been admitted 3 days earlier with pneumonia and was struggling to recover. His condition had been stable, but Sarah noticed that morning that his breathing seemed more labored than usual. His oxygen saturation levels were lower than they should be, and he appeared more confused than he had been the previous day. Bob's daughter, Linda, had been staying at the hospital since his admission. She was a teacher in her 40s who had taken time off work to be with her father. Linda was clearly exhausted from worry and lack of sleep, but she refused to leave his side. She told Sarah that her father had always been strong and independent, and seeing him in this condition was breaking her heart. During her morning rounds, Sarah spent extra time with Bob, checking his breathing and monitoring his vital signs more frequently than the standard protocol required. She noticed that his condition seemed to be declining gradually throughout the morning. His temperature was slightly elevated, his breathing was becoming more shallow, and he was becoming increasingly disoriented. At around 11 in the morning, Sarah was in another patient's room when she heard the sound of Bob's oxygen alarm going off. She quickly excused herself and hurried to his room. What she found alarmed her immediately. Bob was struggling to breathe, his lips had a bluish tint, and his oxygen saturation had dropped to dangerously low levels. Linda was standing by his bed, holding his hand and looking terrified. Sarah quickly increased Bob's oxygen flow and called for the respiratory therapist. She also paged the attending physician, Dr. Marcus Thompson, who was supposed to be making rounds on the floor. However, Dr. Thompson was currently in surgery and wouldn't be available for at least 2 hours. The resident doctor assigned to the floor was dealing with an emergency in another wing. As Sarah worked to stabilize Bob's breathing, she realized that his condition was deteriorating rapidly. His blood pressure was dropping, and his heart rate was becoming irregular. She had seen similar situations during her nursing school clinicals, and she knew that Bob needed immediate intervention if he was going to survive. The hospital's protocol in such situations was clear. Sarah was supposed to call for the attending physician and wait for orders before taking any major action. However, with no doctor immediately available and Bob's condition worsening by the minute, Sarah faced a difficult decision. She could follow protocol and, potentially watch Bob's condition become critical, or she could take action based on her training and judgment. Sarah's nursing education had taught her to recognize the signs of respiratory failure and septic shock. Bob was showing symptoms of both. His infection was spreading, and his body was struggling to fight it off. Without immediate treatment, he could go into complete respiratory and cardiac arrest. Looking at Linda's frightened face and seeing Bob struggle for each breath, Sarah made a decision that would change her life forever. She decided to act on her medical training rather than wait for a doctor who might not arrive in time. She quickly assessed Bob's condition and determined that he needed an immediate increase in his antibiotic treatment and possibly some additional medications to support his blood pressure and breathing. Sarah knew that nurses were not supposed to make these kinds of medical decisions without a doctor's orders. However, she also knew that in emergency situations, nurses sometimes had to act quickly to save lives. She had learned in school about something called standing orders, pre-approved treatments that nurses could implement in certain emergency situations. While Bob's current situation didn't technically fall under the hospital's standing orders, Sarah believed that the principles applied. She quickly reviewed Bob's chart and medical history. He had no known allergies to the medication she was considering, and his previous responses to treatment suggested that he could tolerate the adjustments she had in mind. Sarah also consulted with the charge nurse on duty, explaining the situation and her concerns about Bob's declining condition. The charge nurse, Maria Santos, had been working at the hospital for 15 years and had seen many emergency situations. She looked at Bob's vital signs and agreed that his condition was serious. However, she reminded Sarah about the hospital's strict protocols and suggested that they try to reach another doctor who might be available to give orders. Sarah appreciated Maria's concern, but she could see that Bob's condition was continuing to worsen. His oxygen saturation was now critically low, and his breathing was becoming increasingly labored. Linda was crying and begging someone to help her father. Sarah knew that waiting another 15 or 20 minutes for a doctor could mean the difference between life and death for Bob. After consulting with Maria and explaining her reasoning, Sarah made the decision to implement what she believed was life-saving treatment for Bob. She increased his antibiotic dosage, adjusted his oxygen delivery system, and administered medication to help support his blood pressure. She also started a more aggressive monitoring protocol to track his response to the treatment. Within 30 minutes of Sarah's interventions, Bob's condition began to stabilize. His oxygen saturation improved, his breathing became less labored, and his blood pressure started to return to normal levels. The bluish tint around his lips faded, and he became more alert and responsive. Linda was overjoyed to see her father improving, and she thanked Sarah repeatedly for taking such good care of him. However, Sarah's relief was short-lived. When Mrs. Henley arrived for her afternoon rounds and reviewed the patient charts, she immediately noticed that Sarah had implemented treatments without proper physician orders. Mrs. Henley was furious. She called Sarah into the nurse's station and demanded an explanation for what she considered a serious breach of protocol. Sarah explained the emergency situation, Bob's declining condition, and the unavailability of the attending physician. She showed Mrs. Henley the improvement in Bob's vital signs and emphasized that her actions had potentially saved his life. However, Mrs. Henley was unmoved by these arguments. She stated that protocols existed for good reasons and that nurses who took it upon themselves to make medical decisions were putting patients and the hospital at risk. The confrontation between Sarah and Mrs. Henley was overheard by several other staff members. Some of the nurses sympathized with Sarah's situation, knowing that she had faced a difficult choice with a patient's life hanging in the balance. Others, however, agreed with Mrs. Henley that protocols should never be violated, regardless of the circumstances. Word of the incident spread quickly throughout the veterans' wing. Bob Williams, who was now feeling much better, learned about the controversy surrounding his treatment. When he understood that Sarah might face disciplinary action for helping him, he became upset and asked to speak with the hospital administration. Linda also expressed her support for Sarah, stating that she believed the young nurse had saved her father's life. Dr. Thompson finally arrived on the floor 3 hours after Sarah's initial page. When he examined Bob and reviewed his chart, he was surprised to see the improvement in the veteran's condition. Dr. Thompson acknowledged that Sarah's interventions had been medically appropriate and had likely prevented a more serious medical crisis. However, he also understood the hospital's position on protocol compliance. As word of the incident reached higher levels of hospital administration, Sarah found herself at the center of a growing controversy. Some staff members viewed her as a hero who had put a patient's life before bureaucratic rules. Others saw her as a reckless rookie who had violated important safety protocols. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Bob Williams was not just any patient, he was a decorated Marine veteran whose family had connections throughout the local veteran community. Sarah spent the remainder of her shift wondering about her future at the hospital. She had become a nurse to help people, and she believed she had done exactly that by helping Bob Williams. However, she also understood that hospitals needed rules and procedures to ensure patient safety and legal compliance. The tension between doing what felt right in the moment and following established protocols was something she had never fully considered during her training. As her shift ended that evening, Sarah received a message that Mrs. Henley wanted to meet with her the following morning. The tone of the message suggested that this would not be a routine discussion. Sarah spent a sleepless night wondering if her nursing career was about to end before it had really begun. She thought about her grandmother, who had inspired her to become a nurse, and wondered what advice she would have given in this situation. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital 30 minutes early, hoping to check on Bob Williams before her meeting with Mrs. Henley. She was relieved to find that Bob's condition had continued to improve overnight. He was breathing normally, his vital signs were stable, and he was alert and conversational. Linda was still at his bedside, and she greeted Sarah with a warm smile and another expression of gratitude. Bob himself wanted to thank Sarah personally. With tears in his eyes, the old Marine told her that he had faced enemy fire in Vietnam but had never been as scared as he was during his breathing crisis the previous day. He said that Sarah's quick thinking and caring actions had given him hope when he thought he might not see another day. Linda added that the whole family would be forever grateful for Sarah's dedication and courage. However, the positive feedback from the Williams family could not change the hospital's position on protocol compliance. When Sarah reported to Mrs. Henley's office that morning, she found herself facing not just her supervisor but also the director of nursing and a representative from the hospital's human resources department. The meeting was formal and uncomfortable, with Sarah being asked to explain her actions in detail and defend her decision to override established protocols. Despite Sarah's explanations and the positive outcome for Bob Williams, the hospital administration concluded that her actions constituted a serious violation of policy. They stated that while they understood her good intentions, they could not allow nurses to make independent medical decisions without proper physician oversight. The risk to other patients and the hospital's liability were too great to overlook such breaches of protocol. The decision was made to terminate Sarah's employment effective immediately. She was told to clean out her locker and turn in her badge and keys before leaving the hospital. The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had sacrificed her career to save a patient's life, and, while she didn't regret her actions, she was devastated by the consequences. As word of Sarah's termination spread throughout the hospital, reactions were mixed but passionate. Many of the nurses on the veterans' wing were outraged, believing that Sarah was being punished for doing exactly what nurses were supposed to do, putting patients first. Several veterans and their families who had been cared for by Sarah during her brief time at the hospital expressed their disappointment with the administration's decision. Bob Williams and his daughter Linda were particularly upset when they learned that Sarah had been fired. Bob, despite still being a patient in the hospital, demanded to speak with the hospital administrator. Linda contacted local news outlets, believing that the public should know about a nurse who had risked her career to save a veteran's life. The story began to attract attention beyond the walls of Memorial Veterans Hospital. Sarah Martinez sat in her small apartment that afternoon, staring at the termination letter in her hands. The official hospital letterhead made everything feel more real and more devastating. After 3 years of nursing school, passing her boards, and working so hard to establish herself at Memorial Veterans Hospital, it was all over in a single morning meeting. The letter stated that she had been terminated for failure to follow established medical protocols and practicing beyond the scope of nursing without physician authorization. The cold, clinical language couldn't capture the human story behind those words, a young nurse who had seen a veteran suffering and had acted to save his life. Her phone had been buzzing constantly since she left the hospital. Messages from colleagues, friends from nursing school, and even some patients' families who had heard about what happened. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the attention, but she also felt a growing sense of injustice. She had saved Bob Williams' life, yet she was being treated like she had committed a crime. That evening, Linda Williams called Sarah directly. Through tears, Linda told her that Bob was continuing to improve and would likely be discharged within a few days. But, more importantly, Linda wanted Sarah to know that she and her father were not going to let this injustice stand without a fight. Linda had contacted her local congressman's office, explaining that a nurse had been fired for saving a veteran's life. She had also reached out to veteran advocacy groups and local news stations. Linda was a respected teacher in the community, and her story was beginning to gain traction with people who understood the value of both good medical care and supporting veterans. Meanwhile, back at Memorial Veterans Hospital, the controversy was creating divisions among the staff. The nurses on the veterans wing were particularly upset. Many of them had years of experience and had faced similar situations where they had to make quick decisions to help patients. They saw Sarah's termination as an attack on nursing judgment and patient advocacy. Maria Santos, the charge nurse who had been on duty during the incident, felt particularly conflicted. She had supported Sarah's assessment of Bob Williams' condition, even though she had advised caution about protocol. Maria had worked at the hospital long enough to understand the politics and legal concerns that drove administrative decisions, but she also believed that nurses had a professional responsibility to advocate for their patients. Dr. Marcus Thompson, the attending physician who had been in surgery during Bob's crisis, was also troubled by the situation. When he finally had a chance to review everything that had happened, he realized that Sarah's interventions had been medically appropriate and timely. In fact, her quick thinking had likely prevented Bob from requiring intensive care or potentially facing life-threatening complications. Dr. Thompson decided to write a formal letter to the hospital administration, supporting Sarah's clinical judgment and recommending that her termination be reconsidered. He explained that the treatments Sarah had implemented were within the range of what he would have ordered if he had been available. He also noted that emergency situations sometimes required nurses to act quickly, and that Sarah had demonstrated exactly the kind of clinical thinking that made for excellent nursing care. However, the hospital administration was facing pressure from multiple directions. The legal department was concerned about liability issues if they appeared to support nurses making independent medical decisions. The risk management team worried about setting precedents that could lead to more protocol violations. Insurance companies had strict guidelines about maintaining proper authorization procedures for all medical treatments. Mrs. Patricia Henley, Sarah's former supervisor, was also dealing with criticism from her own staff. Several experienced nurses had come to her, arguing that Sarah's termination was unfair and potentially harmful to morale throughout the veterans' wing. They pointed out that many of them had bent rules in emergency situations over the years, and they worried about being second-guessed for future clinical decisions. The story was beginning to attract media attention beyond the local level. A reporter from San Antonio's largest newspaper contacted the hospital for comment about the nurse who had been fired for saving a veteran's life. The hospital's public relations department issued a carefully worded statement about the importance of patient safety and protocol compliance, but they declined to discuss specific personnel matters. Social media was also picking up the story. Veterans organizations across Texas began sharing posts about Sarah's situation, with many expressing outrage that someone who had risked her career to help a veteran was being punished. The hashtag #SaveTheNurse began trending locally, with people sharing their own stories about healthcare workers who had gone above and beyond to help patients. Bob Williams, despite his recent illness, was determined to make his voice heard. From his hospital bed, he gave an interview to a local television news crew, speaking about his military service and his gratitude for Sarah's care. With his voice still weak from pneumonia, Bob told the reporter that Sarah had shown the same kind of courage and quick thinking that he had seen in young soldiers during combat. The interview was powerful and emotional. Bob spoke about serving 2 tours in Vietnam, coming home to a country that didn't always appreciate veterans, and struggling with health issues in his later years. He said that when he was fighting for his life in that hospital room, Sarah had fought for him too. He couldn't understand how someone could be punished for saving a veteran's life. Linda Williams appeared alongside her father in the interview, describing the terrifying moments when she thought she might lose him. She told the reporter that Sarah had been an angel in their darkest hour, providing not just medical care but also comfort and hope. Linda made it clear that she would not let Sarah's sacrifice be forgotten or dismissed. The interview aired on the evening news and was shared widely online. Viewers responded with an outpouring of support for Sarah and criticism of the hospital's decision. Many people called the hospital directly to express their opinions, and the switchboard was overwhelmed with calls from supporters who wanted Sarah reinstated. Veteran organizations across the state began organizing support for Sarah. The American Legion Post in San Antonio issued a statement calling her termination an insult to every veteran who depends on quality healthcare. The Veterans of Foreign Wars organization in Texas launched a petition demanding that the hospital reconsider its decision and recognize Sarah's heroic actions. Local politicians also began weighing in on the controversy. The mayor of San Antonio issued a statement praising nurses who put patients first and calling for a review of hospital policies that might prevent healthcare workers from providing necessary care. State representatives began asking questions about veteran healthcare policies and whether bureaucratic procedures were interfering with patient care. Sarah found herself at the center of a growing movement that was much larger than her individual situation. She received calls from reporters, veteran advocates, and nursing organizations from across the country. Many people wanted to hear her story directly and understand her perspective on what had happened. In her first public interview, Sarah spoke quietly but firmly about her decision to help Bob Williams. She explained that she had become a nurse to help people, and that when she saw a patient in distress, her training and instincts told her to act. She acknowledged that she had broken hospital protocol, but she said she would make the same decision again if faced with a similar situation. Sarah also talked about her respect for veterans and her belief that they deserved the best possible care. She mentioned her grandfather, who had served in World War II, and said that she had thought about him when she saw Bob Williams struggling to breathe. She wanted to make sure that every veteran received the kind of care that her grandfather would have wanted. The interview was broadcast on multiple news stations and shared widely on social media. Sarah's quiet dignity and obvious sincerity made a powerful impression on viewers. Many people commented that she represented the best qualities of nursing, compassion, skill, and the courage to do what was right even when it was difficult. Professional nursing organizations also began taking notice of Sarah's case. The Texas Nurses Association issued a statement supporting nurses' professional judgment and calling for policies that allowed healthcare workers to provide appropriate care in emergency situations. They argued that Sarah's case highlighted the tension between administrative procedures and clinical decision-making that many nurses face daily. The controversy was also attracting attention from nursing schools and medical ethicists. Several professors used Sarah's case as an example in classroom discussions about professional responsibility, protocol compliance, and patient advocacy. The situation raised complex questions about when healthcare workers should follow rules and when they should trust their clinical judgment. Meanwhile, Sarah was struggling with the practical consequences of losing her job. She was facing financial pressure with student loans to repay and living expenses to cover. The nursing job market was competitive, and she worried that her termination would make it difficult to find another position. Some hospitals might view her as a troublemaker who couldn't follow rules, regardless of the circumstances. However, Sarah was also receiving unexpected support from the nursing community. Several nurses from other hospitals reached out to offer job recommendations and references. Some nurse managers privately told her that they would be interested in hiring someone with her clinical judgment and patient advocacy skills. A particularly meaningful gesture came from a group of veteran nurses who had served in military hospitals. These women and men understood both the importance of protocol and the necessity of quick action in life-threatening situations. They formed an informal support network for Sarah, offering both emotional support and practical advice about her career. The story was now receiving national attention. major news networks picked up the story of the nurse who had been fired for saving a veteran's life. Cable news programs featured discussions about healthcare bureaucracy, patient advocacy, and the challenges facing nurses in modern hospitals. Sarah's case was becoming a symbol of larger issues in American healthcare. Medical professionals from across the country weighed in on social media and in interviews. Many doctors and nurses shared their own experiences of having to make quick decisions in emergency situations. They argued that healthcare workers needed some flexibility to respond to urgent medical needs, even if it meant bending bureaucratic rules. However, hospital administrators and legal experts also made their voices heard. They explained the complex liability and safety issues that hospitals faced when employees acted outside established protocols. They argued that while individual cases might seem unfair, consistent policy enforcement was necessary to protect patients and institutions from potential harm. The debate was becoming more than just about Sarah Martinez and Bob Williams. It was touching on fundamental questions about healthcare delivery, professional autonomy, and the balance between safety procedures and clinical judgment. Medical ethics experts noted that Sarah's case illustrated classic dilemmas that healthcare workers faced regularly. As the controversy grew, pressure mounted on Memorial Veterans Hospital to reconsider their decision. Donors threatened to withdraw support, and some physicians expressed concerns about working in an environment where nurses might be punished for good clinical judgment. The hospital's board of directors was receiving calls and letters from prominent community members asking them to review Sarah's case. Bob Williams had been discharged from the hospital, but he continued to speak out about Sarah's situation. Despite his recent illness, he attended rallies and spoke at veteran organization meetings. His presence added powerful authenticity to the campaign for Sarah's reinstatement. Here was the veteran whose life had been saved, personally advocating for the nurse who had helped him. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah Martinez lost her job, and the controversy showed no signs of dying down. If anything, the story had taken on a life of its own, spreading far beyond San Antonio and reaching veterans, nurses, and concerned citizens across the nation. What had started as a local hospital employment issue had become a national conversation about healthcare, protocol, and doing what's right. Sarah was spending her days in a strange routine of job searching, media interviews, and trying to process the overwhelming response to her situation. Her small apartment had become an informal headquarters for phone calls from supporters, job offers from distant hospitals, and requests from journalists who wanted to tell her story. She felt grateful for the support but also overwhelmed by the attention. The financial pressure was real and growing. Sarah's savings were dwindling, and her student loan payments were due regardless of her employment status. She had been applying to hospitals throughout Texas and surrounding states, but the process was slow, and she worried that her high-profile termination might work against her despite the public support. However, something unexpected was happening within the veteran community. Bob Williams had been working quietly behind the scenes, using connections he had maintained from his decades of involvement with veteran organizations. Bob had served as a Marine in Vietnam, and, over the years, he had stayed connected with other veterans who had gone on to various careers in civilian life. One of Bob's oldest friends was retired Navy Captain James Jim Rodriguez, who now worked as a civilian contractor with the Department of Veterans Affairs. Jim had been following Sarah's story through Bob's frequent phone calls and social media posts. As a former military officer, Jim understood both the importance of following procedures and the necessity of quick decision-making in crisis situations. Captain Rodriguez had been thinking about Sarah's case from a different angle than most of the people commenting on the story. As someone who had spent 30 years in military service and now worked with veteran healthcare systems, he recognized something in Sarah's actions that reminded him of the best qualities he had seen in military medics and corpsmen. During his Navy career, Jim had witnessed countless situations where young medics had to make split-second decisions under pressure. He had seen 19-year-old corpsmen save lives by acting quickly and decisively when standard procedures weren't fast enough. The ability to assess a situation, trust your training, and act with courage was exactly what made the difference between life and death in combat situations. Jim began making phone calls to contacts he had maintained throughout the military and veteran affairs communities. He spoke with other retired officers, current military medical personnel, and civilian contractors who worked with veteran healthcare. He shared Sarah's story and asked whether anyone might be interested in someone with her clinical judgment and dedication to veteran care. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Military medical personnel were always looking for healthcare workers who understood the unique needs of veterans and who could think quickly under pressure. Sarah's willingness to risk her career to save a veteran's life demonstrated exactly the kind of commitment and judgment that military medical teams valued. One of Jim's contacts was Commander Lisa Park, a Navy nurse who was currently stationed at Naval Medical Center San Diego. Commander Park had been following Sarah's story through Veteran Network Communications and was impressed by what she had heard. As someone who had spent her career caring for military personnel, she understood the importance of nurses who could make sound clinical decisions independently. Commander Park reached out to her colleagues at various military medical facilities, sharing Sarah's story and qualifications. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Military hospitals and clinics operated under different protocols than civilian facilities, and they often needed nurses who could work independently and make quick decisions in challenging situations. Meanwhile, the public campaign for Sarah's reinstatement was intensifying. A Facebook group called Justice for Nurse Sarah had grown to over 50,000 members, with people sharing stories about healthcare workers who had gone above and beyond for patients. The group was organizing letter-writing campaigns, peaceful protests, and fundraising efforts to help Sarah during her period of unemployment. The Texas Nurses Association had officially taken up Sarah's case, providing legal support and advocating for policy changes that would protect nurses who made appropriate clinical decisions in emergency situations. They argued that Sarah's case highlighted the need for clearer guidelines that allowed nurses to use their professional judgment while still maintaining patient safety. Veterans organizations across multiple states were also organizing support. The American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars, and Disabled American Veterans had all issued statements supporting Sarah and calling for recognition of her service to the veteran community. Some posts were organizing caravans to San Antonio to show support and demand that the hospital reconsider its decision. The media attention was also bringing unexpected opportunities. Several hospitals from across the country had reached out to Sarah with job offers, recognizing that someone with her clinical skills and dedication to patient care would be valuable to their organizations. Some specifically mentioned their veteran care programs and their need for nurses who understood military culture and veteran health issues. However, Sarah was being selective about these opportunities. She wanted to make sure that her next position would be with an organization that valued clinical judgment and patient advocacy. She had learned from her experience at Memorial Veterans Hospital that workplace culture was just as important as clinical opportunities. During this period, Sarah received a phone call that would change everything. The caller identified himself as Captain Rodriguez and explained his connection to Bob Williams. He told Sarah about his work with Veteran Affairs and his interest in her case. But, more importantly, he told her about conversations he had been having with military medical personnel who were impressed by her story. Captain Rodriguez explained that military medical facilities operated differently than civilian hospitals. Military medics, corpsmen, and nurses were expected to make independent decisions under pressure, and they were trained to trust their judgment when lives were at stake. He suggested that Sarah's skills and instincts might be particularly well suited for military healthcare. The conversation was intriguing, but Sarah wasn't sure how it might relate to her situation. Captain Rodriguez was somewhat mysterious about the details, but he asked whether she would be interested in learning more about opportunities to serve veteran and military communities. He mentioned that some very interesting possibilities might be developing, and he would like to keep in touch about her career plans. Sarah agreed to stay in contact with Captain Rodriguez, though she wasn't sure what to expect from the conversation. She appreciated the support from the veteran community, but she was focused on finding a nursing position where she could return to patient care as soon as possible. The next few days brought a series of surprising developments. Sarah began receiving calls from people who identified themselves as being connected with military medical services, veteran affairs, and defense contracting organizations. The conversations were professional but somewhat vague, with people expressing interest in her background and asking about her flexibility regarding work locations and assignments. One particularly interesting call came from someone who identified herself as a nurse recruiter for a government healthcare contractor. The woman explained that they provided medical services in various challenging environments and were always looking for nurses with strong clinical judgment and the ability to work independently. She asked whether Sarah would be interested in positions that might involve travel and work with veteran populations. These conversations were intriguing but also confusing. Sarah wasn't sure what kind of opportunities were being discussed, and the people she spoke with were often vague about specific details. However, they all seemed to know her story and were impressed by her willingness to risk her career to help a veteran. Meanwhile, the controversy at Memorial Veterans Hospital was reaching a boiling point. The board of directors was facing unprecedented pressure from multiple directions. Donors were threatening to withdraw funding, physicians were expressing concerns about the work environment, and nursing staff morale was at an all-time low. Mrs. Patricia Henley, Sarah's former supervisor, was also under pressure. Several experienced nurses on the veterans wing had formally requested transfers to other departments, stating that they no longer felt comfortable working under supervision that they viewed as punitive and unsupportive of clinical judgment. Some had even submitted resignations, citing the hospital's handling of Sarah's case as their reason for leaving. Dr. Marcus Thompson, the attending physician who had supported Sarah's clinical decisions, was also making his voice heard more forcefully. He had organized a group of physicians who were calling for policy changes that would provide clearer guidelines for nurse decision-making in emergency situations. They argued that good nurses like Sarah were exactly what the hospital needed, not problems to be eliminated. The hospital's legal department was also reassessing their position. While they remained concerned about liability issues, they were beginning to understand that the public relations damage from Sarah's termination might be more costly than any potential legal risks from supporting appropriate nurse clinical judgment. Bob Williams continued to be a powerful advocate for Sarah's cause. Despite his recent illness, he was attending every public event related to her case. His presence as the veteran whose life had been saved made a compelling argument that was difficult for anyone to dismiss. Bob's military bearing and obvious gratitude for Sarah's care resonated with audiences throughout the community. Linda Williams had also become an effective spokesperson for Sarah's case. As a respected teacher and community member, Linda was able to articulate the human side of the controversy in ways that connected with families and working people. She spoke about watching her father struggle to breathe and feeling helpless until Sarah took action to save his life. The story was now receiving international attention, with news outlets from other countries reporting on the American nurse who had been fired for saving a veteran's life. The story seemed to capture global interest as an example of bureaucracy conflicting with human compassion and professional judgment. Medical and nursing journals were also publishing articles about Sarah's case, using it as an example of the complex ethical and legal issues that healthcare workers face daily. Professional conferences were featuring panel discussions about protocol compliance versus clinical judgment, with Sarah's situation serving as a case study. As the fourth week approached, Sarah received another call from Captain Rodriguez. This time, he was more specific about the opportunities he had been investigating. He explained that several military medical facilities and defense contractors had expressed serious interest in recruiting her for positions that would allow her to use her clinical skills to serve veteran and military communities. More intriguingly, Captain Rodriguez mentioned that some of these opportunities were with organizations that specifically valued independent thinking and quick decision-making. He suggested that Sarah's experience at Memorial Veterans Hospital, while painful, had actually demonstrated exactly the qualities that these organizations were seeking in healthcare personnel. Captain Rodriguez asked whether Sarah would be available for a phone interview with some military medical personnel who were interested in discussing opportunities with her. He explained that these conversations might lead to job offers that would not only restore her career but potentially provide her with more meaningful work serving the military community. Sarah agreed to the interviews, curious about what opportunities might be available. She was particularly interested in the idea of working with organizations that valued clinical judgment and patient advocacy. Her experience at Memorial Veterans Hospital had taught her the importance of finding a workplace culture that supported good nursing practice. The interviews were scheduled for the following week, and Captain Rodriguez provided Sarah with some background information about the military medical system and how it differed from civilian healthcare. He explained that military medical personnel were trained to be more independent and decisive, qualities that were essential when providing care in challenging environments. As Sarah prepared for these interviews, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. For weeks earlier, she had been a rookie nurse worried about keeping her first job. Now she was at the center of a national conversation about healthcare ethics and was being courted by organizations that valued exactly the qualities that had gotten her fired. She thought about her grandmother, who had inspired her to become a nurse, and wondered what she would think about all that had happened. Sarah believed that her grandmother would have been proud of her decision to help Bob Williams, regardless of the consequences. And perhaps these new opportunities were a sign that there were places in healthcare where doing the right thing was still valued above following bureaucratic rules. Sarah Martinez was sitting in a coffee shop near her apartment, reviewing notes for her upcoming interviews with military medical recruiters. It had been exactly 4 weeks since her termination from Memorial Veterans Hospital, and her life had taken turns she never could have imagined. The morning sun streamed through the window as she sipped her coffee and tried to process everything that had happened. Her phone had been buzzing with messages of support from across the country. Veterans, nurses, and concerned citizens continued to follow her story and offer encouragement. The Facebook group Justice for Nurse Sarah had grown to over 100,000 members, and donations were coming in to help with her living expenses while she searched for a new position. The interviews with military medical personnel had gone remarkably well. Sarah had spoken with nurse recruiters from the Navy, Army, and several defense contractors who provided medical services to military facilities. All of them had been impressed by her clinical judgment, her dedication to veteran care, and her willingness to take responsibility for difficult decisions under pressure. One particularly promising conversation had been with Commander Lisa Park from Naval Medical Center San Diego. Commander Park had explained that military medical facilities needed nurses who could work independently and make sound clinical decisions in challenging situations. She had mentioned that Sarah's experience with Bob Williams demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking and courage that military medical teams valued. The most intriguing opportunity had come from a defense contractor that provided medical services to remote military installations and special operations units. The position would involve significant travel and work in environments where nurses needed to be highly independent and decisive. The recruiter had explained that Sarah's combination of clinical skills and demonstrated judgment under pressure made her an ideal candidate for this type of work. As Sarah reflected on these opportunities, she realized that being fired from Memorial Veterans Hospital might have been the best thing that could have happened to her career. She was discovering possibilities she never would have considered otherwise, and she was being recruited by organizations that specifically valued the qualities that had gotten her in trouble at her previous job. Meanwhile, the pressure on Memorial Veterans Hospital had continued to intensify. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting to address the ongoing controversy surrounding Sarah's termination. Board members were facing criticism from major donors, community leaders, and even some of their own family members who had been following the story. Dr. Marcus Thompson had organized a formal petition signed by over 60 physicians on the hospital staff, calling for Sarah's reinstatement and policy changes to protect appropriate nurse clinical judgment. The petition argued that the hospital was losing excellent healthcare workers because of overly rigid interpretations of protocol compliance. The nursing staff situation had become critical. 7 experienced nurses from the Veterans Wing had submitted resignations, and several more had requested transfers to other departments. Exit interviews revealed that the handling of Sarah's case had created an atmosphere where nurses felt they couldn't trust their own clinical judgment or advocate effectively for their patients. Mrs. Patricia Henley, Sarah's former supervisor, was facing a crisis of confidence from her own staff. The charge nurses who reported to her had submitted a formal complaint to the nursing administration, arguing that the punitive approach to Sarah's case was damaging morale and compromising patient care. They requested that Mrs. Henley be reassigned to a position that didn't involve direct supervision of clinical staff. Bob Williams had also escalated his advocacy efforts. Working with Captain Rodriguez and other veteran advocates, Bob had organized a letter-writing campaign that reached the offices of senators, congressmen, and even the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. The letters described Sarah's care and called for recognition of her service to the veteran community. The media attention was also bringing unwanted scrutiny to Memorial Veterans Hospital's overall operations. Investigative reporters were looking into other cases where nurses or other healthcare workers might have been disciplined for patient advocacy. They were also examining the hospital's policies and comparing them to other medical facilities in the region. On the morning that would change everything, Sarah was preparing to leave for another interview when her phone rang. The caller identified himself as Lieutenant Colonel Michael Chen from the U.S. Navy Medical Corps. He explained that he was calling on behalf of a special military medical unit that had been following her story with great interest. Lieutenant Colonel Chen told Sarah that he represented a unit that provided medical support to Navy Special Operations teams. He explained that they were constantly looking for medical personnel who could think independently, make quick decisions under pressure, and maintain the highest standards of patient care in challenging environments. Sarah's actions in saving Bob Williams had caught their attention as an example of exactly the kind of judgment and courage they needed. The conversation was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Lieutenant Colonel Chen spoke with authority and precision, but also with genuine respect for her clinical abilities and professional integrity. He explained that special operations medical teams operated under different protocols than traditional military medical facilities, with much greater emphasis on individual judgment and rapid decision-making. More surprisingly, Lieutenant Colonel Chen mentioned that his unit had been authorized to offer Sarah a direct commission as a Navy nurse officer, with the rank of lieutenant junior grade. This would allow her to join the Navy Medical Corps immediately, with full recognition of her civilian nursing education and clinical experience. The offer was conditional on her completing a brief orientation program and agreeing to serve for a minimum of 4 years. Sarah was stunned by the offer. She had never considered military service, though she had always respected those who served. The idea of becoming a Navy officer and working with special operations teams was both exciting and intimidating. Lieutenant Colonel Chen explained that she would have 24 hours to consider the offer, and that a helicopter would be dispatched to bring her to Naval Air Station Corpus Christi for further discussions if she was interested. As Sarah hung up the phone, her mind was racing. This was an opportunity she had never imagined, coming at a time when her civilian nursing career seemed uncertain. The chance to serve her country while using her clinical skills to help military personnel was appealing, especially given her positive experiences with the veteran community throughout this controversy. She immediately called Bob Williams to tell him about the offer. Bob was thrilled and encouraged her to seriously consider the opportunity. As a Marine veteran, he understood the honor and responsibility of military service, and he believed that Sarah's skills and character made her perfect for supporting those who served their country. Linda Williams was equally excited when she heard the news. She told Sarah that this opportunity seemed like perfect recognition for everything she had been through. Linda pointed out that Sarah would be moving from being punished for helping a veteran to being honored with the chance to serve all military personnel. Captain Rodriguez was not surprised when Sarah called to tell him about the Navy's offer. He revealed that he had been quietly advocating for Sarah within military medical circles, sharing her story and highlighting her qualifications for military service. He had believed from the beginning that her skills and judgment would be valued in the military medical system. Sarah spent the rest of the day researching naval medical careers and special operations support roles. She learned that Navy medical officers worked with some of the most elite military units in the world, providing medical care in challenging and often dangerous environments. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of service members. That evening, Sarah made her decision. She called Lieutenant Colonel Chen and accepted the offer to visit Naval Air Station Corpus Christi for further discussions. She explained that she was very interested in the opportunity to serve but wanted to learn more about the specific responsibilities and training requirements. Lieutenant Colonel Chen was pleased with her response and confirmed that a helicopter would arrive the next morning to transport her to the naval facility. He explained that she would meet with senior medical officers, tour the facilities, and receive detailed information about her potential role with special operations medical teams. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Sarah had packed a small bag and was waiting at the designated landing zone, a field near the outskirts of San Antonio that was sometimes used for medical helicopter landings. She felt nervous but excited about the unknown adventure ahead. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, she heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the distance. As the aircraft came into view, Sarah could see the Navy markings and the professional crew inside. The helicopter was a modern medical transport, equipped with advanced communication systems and medical equipment. The helicopter landed smoothly, and a crew member approached Sarah to confirm her identity and help her aboard. As she climbed into the aircraft, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. For weeks earlier, she had been a fired nurse with an uncertain future. Now she was being transported by military helicopter to discuss becoming a Navy officer. As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah looked down at San Antonio disappearing below. She thought about Bob Williams, who was probably watching the news coverage of her departure, and about all the veterans and nurses who had supported her throughout this controversy. She hoped that her story might inspire other healthcare workers to trust their judgment and advocate for their patients, regardless of the personal consequences. The flight to Corpus Christi took about an hour, during which Sarah was able to speak with the crew about their experiences in military medical service. The pilot was a former Navy corpsman who had become an officer, and he shared stories about the meaningful work that military medical personnel performed around the world. When the helicopter landed at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi, Sarah was met by Lieutenant Colonel Chan and several other senior medical officers. The base was impressive, with modern facilities and a sense of purposeful activity that reminded Sarah of the best aspects of hospital environments she had experienced during her training. The meetings that followed were comprehensive and exciting. Sarah learned about the Navy's medical training programs, the various assignments available to nurse officers, and the specific requirements for supporting special operations teams. The officers she met were clearly impressed by her background and her commitment to patient care under difficult circumstances. By the end of the day, Sarah had made her decision. She formally accepted the offer to become a Navy nurse officer and to serve with special operations medical teams. The paperwork was completed, and she was sworn in as Lieutenant Junior Grade Sarah Martinez, United States Navy Medical Corps. The news of Sarah's commission spread quickly through the veteran community and social media. The story of the nurse who had been fired for saving a veteran and then honored with a Navy commission captured the imagination of people across the country. Many saw it as a perfect example of how good people who do the right thing are ultimately recognized and rewarded. Bob Williams was interviewed by multiple news outlets about Sarah's new role. With tears in his eyes, the old Marine expressed his pride in seeing the nurse who had saved his life honored with the opportunity to serve her country. He said that Sarah's commission proved that good actions are eventually rewarded, even when they initially seem to lead to punishment. Memorial Veterans Hospital faced renewed criticism as news of Sarah's Navy commission spread. Many people pointed out the irony that a nurse they had fired for helping a veteran was now being honored by the Navy for exactly the same qualities that had gotten her in trouble. The hospital's board of directors faced calls for a complete review of their personnel policies and administrative procedures. 3 months later, Lieutenant Sarah Martinez graduated from Navy Medical Officer training as the honor graduate of her class. Her instructors noted her exceptional clinical judgment, her dedication to patient care, and her natural leadership abilities. She was assigned to work with Navy SEAL medical teams, providing advanced medical support to some of the most elite military units in the world. During her graduation ceremony, several special guests were present, including Bob and Linda Williams, Captain Rodriguez, and many of the veterans and nurses who had supported her throughout her controversy at Memorial Veterans Hospital. Bob Williams had the honor of pinning Sarah's new lieutenant bars on her uniform, a moment that brought tears to everyone present. In her graduation speech, Lieutenant Martinez spoke about the importance of trusting your training, standing up for what's right, and never giving up on serving others. She thanked all the veterans and healthcare workers who had supported her and encouraged other nurses to trust their clinical judgment and advocate for their patients. Years later, Sarah's story continued to be told in nursing schools and military medical training programs as an example of professional courage and the importance of patient advocacy. She had gone on to serve with distinction in multiple deployments, saving countless lives and training other military medical personnel. Bob Williams lived for many more years, always proud to tell people about the nurse who had risked her career to save his life and had gone on to serve her country with honor. He never missed an opportunity to advocate for healthcare workers who put patients first, regardless of personal consequences. The helicopter that had carried Sarah to her new life became a symbol of how unexpected opportunities can emerge from difficult circumstances. For Sarah, it represented the moment when standing up for what's right led not to the end of her career, but to the beginning of a life of service that was more meaningful than anything she had ever imagined.